Art Gallery of New South Wales. So, what is modernism?
Modernism is that artistic revolution that happened late 19th century, now called by a lot of people. There have been various names for it, but most recently Bernard Smith, you might know, an Australian scholar, has termed it the formalisque, and that's an absolutely key term to indicate what modernism was. It was an interest in the formal qualities of art. So less an interest in illusionism or naturalism, and an interest more in the way one formally constructs an artwork. And of course it eventually leads to the greatest revolution in 20th century art, which is abstraction.
As a curator, how do you see Dobell fitting in Australian modern masterpieces?
Extremely well. The first way actually to answer that is to perhaps make the distinction between modern and modernist. So the show that's coming up, there are 40 works from our collection, and as I said before, they represent a time, and actually it's most of the 20th century, where all sorts of different strains of work are going on, and a time when there were traditional painters still interested in modern subjects, still interested in imaging the city, for example, as opposed to the landscape, which had always been the preeminent form of Australian art practice. And then, of course, there were modernists, people who were interested in a whole range of different issues. So Dobell fits into the category of traditionalists, but still interested in subjects of modern life, and interested in portraits that represented contemporary times, but not a modernist.
How do you personally see Dobell's work in relation to his contemporaries?
Well, in terms of his Australian contemporaries, actually there was a really wide spread of artists working in the interwar decades and then into the 40s and 50s, modernists and more establishment painters. So he's an establishment painter, he's an artist who's very interested, in fact embedded really, in the idea of the European tradition and all of that involved. He looked back to the 18th century, to Gainsborough in terms of his portraiture, for example. He looked to Renoir. He looked to a whole range of old masters, and it's clear that it was very important to him that his work was part of that heritage and part of that legacy. But there were other artists who were also establishment artists at the time. They might have been interested in modern subjects, but they were interested in portraying those modern subjects in establishment or quite traditional ways. Then there were others, of course, like Preston, like Cossington Smith, like Roy de Meester, who were interested in expressing modern life in really very modernistic ways.
What made Dobell's 1943 Archibald Prize win so controversial?
So the portrait was of Joshua Smith. What made it so controversial? Well, in the end, what made it so controversial really was that Joseph Wolemski and Mary Edwards, who very soon afterwards became Mary Edward Burke, mounted a case against the win. So they took both Dobell and the trustees of the Art Gallery of New South Wales to court on the basis that the work was not a portrait under the terms of the Archibald Prize, but that it was a caricature. And then ensued the most enormous and in some ways actually quite scandalous controversy about whether Dobell's portrait was a caricature or a portrait. And in fact, finally, the judge threw the case out because there was no real case to answer. It was very clear that the portrait had been painted by Dobell in exactly the same way as he painted all of his portraits, a quite traditional way, but with a very strong interest in elongation, distortion, a whole range of attributes that would service the desire to present a really strong psychological portrait. He was strongly backed up by art establishment figures, and he was actually strongly opposed by some other art figures, but it didn't get up. And it was a really, in retrospect, it was just a bizarre and awful thing. And how did it happen? How could it have happened?
Well, like a personal attack, possibly?
Oh, well, I think in the way these things go, it segued into sets of personal attacks. And of course, Joshua Smith himself was very much attacked. I think he had to appear as an exhibit in the court case. Some people said the distortions that Dobell had used when he portrayed Joshua Smith, who was a very skinny fellow anyway, but he's made to look you know, rather more insect-like.
Yes.
But as if that could be a criteria for excluding a fabulous portrait from getting a prize.
Dobell had a second Archibald Prize win in 1948 with his portrait of Margaret Olive. How do you think this influenced his later career?
Well, interestingly enough, it was not really controversial, but it also created an enormous amount of attention. Now, maybe that was partly because the 43 case still being, or 44 case in fact, and the 43 win still being on the agenda for a lot of people. But Margaret Olive herself sort of hid from the public, as I can remember. I actually do remember a very conservative critic, James MacDonald, at the time, describing the Margaret Olive portrait as fat, fatuous and falling over. Which was shocking, and I think that's partly why she hid. So I think there was an attempt to try and make some form of controversy out of it, and there were clearly some very academic and conservative critics which didn't like, who didn't like the portrait. But otherwise, I think it was an absolutely celebrated win, and it became almost immediately an icon of Australian art.
After spending some years as a recluse, Dobell came out of hiding to win the Archibald again with a frothy and affectionate portrait of his fellow artist Margaret Olive. But some of the press tried to drum up another scandal. Olive herself fled overseas, and once again Bill Dobell was questioned about the controversial nature of his work.
What is the significance of this portrait to the Art Gallery of the New South Wales collection?
It's one of our most loved paintings, for a start. So ever since we acquired it, it's been on display constantly. And really it's one of the treasures of the Art Gallery of New South Wales collection, and there are many, and there are many Sydney treasures, slightly less Melbourne treasures, and other treasures from around Australia. But it's, in terms of the larger history of Australian art and larger traditions of Australian art, it's an absolutely iconic work. It's one of those just marvellous portraits produced by an artist at the peak of his artistic prowess.
What is the significance of the strapper to the Newcastle Art Gallery collection?
Well, I should think it's one of their gems. It's a really marvellous portrait. So it's, you were talking about Joshua Smith earlier. I mean, in many ways, the strapper is the more sort of elegant version, I guess, of the elongations and the distortions I talked about before in a portrait. So, you know, the strapper's been known amongst, you know, curators and art historians and people interested in art as one of the prime early 40s portraits by Dobell. Clearly, Dobell has made the notion of a strapper, the function of a strapper, what he does, groom horses, and the rendering of the strapper himself quite simpatico. So it's really interesting to see the way he very deftly and actually very lightly touches on sort of elongations and distortions and, you know, the kind of mane of hair that the strapper's got to make those sorts of points. And so to come across with a really kind of gorgeously coloured, very sort of sonorous, I suppose, in its colour, psychologically rich portrait.
On behalf of Callaghan College and Newcastle Art Gallery, we would like to thank you for your time.
Pleasure.